Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today, I want to explore some more counterfactual history, to take a look at what might have been if things had played out slightly differently, if just one moment or one event had gone the other way. This time, I'm going to be asking, what if Prince Arthur Tudor had lived? Let's take a look at it. Before we begin, I would like to briefly explain how I choose to approach the game of counterfactual history. In particular, I want to talk about the rules that I have chosen to impose upon myself. Firstly, while this practice of counterfactual history is absolutely rooted in the available historical information, at least as far as we know it, I always try to remember that once we cross the Rubicon, once we change the known historical event in our own minds, whatever comes next, however our discussion continues, is only ever going to be educated guesswork. Now, personally, I think the value of this guesswork is that it forces us to shine a new light on the event in question, the one we're changing. It helps us, I believe, to really assess its impact, and I think this assessment is made possible in large part because when we play this game, it means that we have removed that particular historical event from the known timeline. It's no longer part of that chain. Additionally, I have set a rule for myself that I will only change one historical event at a time. Everything else that I will be discussing, unless I think it is likely or even conceivable that it would have been impacted by the change I've made, will follow the historical record as far as we know it. So, with all that being said, let's hop in. Prince Arthur was born late on the 19th, or perhaps early on the 20th of September, 1486. He was the eldest child of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. At the point of Arthur's birth, the Tudor dynasty's time on the throne had been relatively short. After all, his father's victory over King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth had taken place just a little over a year previously, on the 22nd of August, 1485. Henry then married Richard's niece, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV, and the sister of the so-called Prince in the Tower, Elizabeth of York, on the 18th of January 1486. And this is just 8 months before the birth of Arthur. So perhaps he came early. Or perhaps Elizabeth of York was already pregnant when this couple married. Is it even possible that Henry VII held off from marrying her until he had the tangible hope of an heir? After all, Elizabeth's coronation did not take place until the 25th of November, 1487, which was more than a year after Arthur's birth. Alternatively, did this couple think, as I believe many of their contemporaries did, that as they had promised to marry each other, they were thus betrothed, and that this was as good as being married? That it was sufficient for them to consummate their relationship without any concern about either divine or human judgment, or indeed censure? Whatever the case may be, a few days after his birth, Arthur was baptised at Winchester Cathedral on the 24th of September, 1486. It is thought that the choice of his name, Arthur, was meant to be an intentional reminder of his mythical namesake and his legendary rule. That Arthur was part of a promise, that through the Tudors there was now hope for the future. On the 29th of November 1489, so just a little after his 3rd birthday, Arthur was made a Knight of the Bath, Earl of Chester and Prince of Wales. More titles and roles would follow. By May of 1490, he was called Warden of all the marches towards Scotland, albeit in this role he did have a deputy in the form of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey. He was then given a role in legal matters, as he was named on commissions of the peace from 1491 onwards. October 1492 saw him named as Keeper of England and also the King's Lieutenant while Henry VII was in France. Arthur's counsel for Wales was also gaining more authority during this period too. Alongside this growing prominence and authority within the realm, which was clearly intended to prepare Arthur for kingship, this little prince also benefited from the very finest academic education that could be obtained in England at that time. According to reports, this Prince of Wales would show himself to be both an able and a willing student. Negotiations for Arthur's marriage to Katherine of Aragon, who was less than a year older than him, had begun when the couple were toddlers. Betrothals and proxy marriages followed until the plans and promises came to fruition, when, on the 2nd of October 1501, a nearly 16-year-old Katherine finally landed in Plymouth. Her life in England had begun. She was making ready to marry Arthur, who had recently turned 15. The pair were wed at St Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November 1501. In the following month, the December, Arthur and Katherine, the newlyweds, travelled to Ludlow, where they would hold court in person as the Prince and Princess of Wales. At least, they would for a few months. Because not long after they arrived, this couple fell dangerously ill, and for one of them, this illness would, of course, prove fatal. But today we are asking the question, what would have happened if Arthur, rather than dying on the 2nd of April 1502, had instead recovered as his wife Katherine did? If he had then gone on to live long enough to follow his father and rule as King of England? I think it's fair to assume that following their recovery, he and Katherine would continue to hold court principally at Ludlow, that Arthur would have become more actively involved in the business of the council there as time went on. They would, though, I think, very likely travel to be part of key events and ceremonies at the court of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Perhaps when this court was in London, the Prince and Princess of Wales would be given a dedicated palace for their use on these occasions, but if not, they would certainly have had access to an entire suite of apartments at whatever palace the King and Queen were at that time, in which to hold themselves, their household and servants. Travelling or progressing around the country with the court and also in their own right is something that would allow this Prince and Princess of Wales to enjoy the hospitality of the English nobility, in addition to being seen by the people, and all of this would make for a smooth transition when it was their turn to become the King and Queen. Perhaps they were in London or its environs in order to witness the proxy marriage of Arthur's sister Margaret, which took place on the 15th of January 1503. This proxy marriage was to prepare for Margaret's move to Scotland to become the wife and queen of King James IV. Is it possible that they remained with the royal court when Elizabeth of York gave birth to her last child, Katherine, which happened at the Tower of London on the 2nd of February 1503? Mother and child would unfortunately die within days of this birth. And perhaps, if they were there, Arthur and Katherine would have performed public duties in relation to the Queen's funeral, in addition to privately mourning her with their family. Did they stay, or perhaps return to see Margaret off on her journey to Scotland on the 8th of July 1503? If Arthur and Katherine's marriage proved to be a happy one, of mutual love and support, Katherine, I think, would likely have turned to Arthur for solace when she received news of her mother's death, which occurred on the 26th of November 1504. Katherine's marriage to the surviving Arthur would have altered the diplomatic situation here. With Katherine's father and her brother-in-law now vying for control of Castile, they were looking to offer brides, and they could do so to Henry VII and or to his younger son Henry. But the heir was spoken for. I think this would have made this particular marriage market slightly less febrile, especially if Katherine was pregnant or had given birth by this point. Indeed, her views on how to proceed in these negotiations may have even held more weight with her father-in-law, and I do wonder who she would have ended up supporting. Her father Ferdinand suggested that his niece Joanna, Dowager Queen of Naples, would be a fitting bride for the recently widowed King Henry VII, while her brother-in-law, husband to her sister Juana, was offering Margaret of Austria for this king instead. However, Philip and Juana also had 2 young daughters and 2 young sons by this point. They could also have played a part. Maybe Eleanor and Isabella might have been suggested as potential matches for Arthur's little brother, Prince Henry. Maybe Charles and Ferdinand might be offered to Arthur's sister, the Princess Mary. Or perhaps these matches were instead seen as being more suitable for the children who were being created by Arthur and Catherine. With the heir of England married, and possibly producing heirs of his own already, perhaps King Henry VII would have agreed to one of the marriage treaties that were on offer from either Ferdinand of Aragon or from Philip and Juana of Castile. Alternatively, perhaps he would have liked to avoid placing himself in the middle of their dispute and instead may have chosen to make a marriage contract with France, where King Louis XII was offering Marguerite of Angoulême as a possible bride for King Henry VII. Either way, I think it's fairly safe to say that when Juana and Philip were forced by storms to make land in England in the January of 1506, they would have spent time with Arthur and Catherine at Henry VII's court at Windsor, but perhaps they would also have been hosted by this couple in their own palace too. Following the death of King Henry VII, on the 21st of April 1509, in this timeline, it would be his 22-year-old son who would follow him onto the throne. Prince Arthur would become King Arthur. He would, no doubt, have been crowned beside his 23-year-old wife within just a couple of months. Now, as we do not know the exact cause of Katherine of Aragon's struggles with childbearing, we simply cannot know if things would have been different for her due to being married to Arthur. However, they may well have been. Not only because staying married to Arthur takes Henry out of the equation, but also because, for the years between 1502 and 1509, she would not have been subjected to the turmoil and neglect that she absolutely was during her period as Arthur's widow. Instead, for these years, she would have been the honoured Princess of Wales, with a husband beside her to share her bed. And so, perhaps Catherine went to her coronation having already provided England with a Prince of Wales, someone who could replace her husband in that role as he became king, and perhaps that boy already had siblings, brothers and sisters who would secure the Tudor dynasty and further its influence abroad through a series of diplomatic marriages. On the other hand, if there were no surviving male heirs born to this couple at all, it's possible, I think, that Catherine, if she had not experienced the torment of those years as Dowager Princess, might have agreed or even volunteered to retire from her marriage. I think it's likely that she would have gone into a religious order, perhaps as an abbess, or certainly as a nun, or living alongside them. This would then allow Arthur to marry again and pursue getting heirs of his own. Alternatively, she might have stayed in her place, remained as Queen of England, as her husband and all of England looked instead to her brother-in-law Prince Henry as the heir presumptive, and also as a possible producer of sons of his own through the marriage that would be made for him. I don't think that we would see anything akin to the Great Matter taking place for Arthur's court and country. Arthur had been raised from his birth to be king. He had experience of governance in his role of Prince of Wales. Indeed, Rosemary Horrocks points out that, quote, conciliar authority in the Marches was strengthened in March 1493 by the grant of various powers to the prince, including the power to appoint justices of Oyer and Termina, and to inquire into franchises. In November that year, he received an extensive land grant in the region, including the estates of the Earldom of March. The fact that Arthur had a younger brother, that England had both an heir and a spare, so to speak, would, I believe, likely have encouraged his father to give him greater freedoms, in terms of the physical pursuits he was allowed to engage in, and just generally in terms of the independence he would be permitted to enjoy, than if Arthur had been the lone male heir. In terms of his temperament and potential approach to monarchy, there is much to suggest that Arthur was quite similar to his father, and so I think it likely that he would, as Henry VII had done, have cultivated a trusted circle of advisers around him when he became king. Perhaps, in fact, many of those who had served his father would have been transferred over to him. But one thing I think is almost certain is that Arthur would have wanted to be fully across all of the business of state, and by that I mean that I think that there probably wouldn't have been room for there to be a standout star to emerge from his councillors. For example, I don't think that Thomas Wolsey would have been able to enjoy the same meteoric rise and ultimate prominence under Arthur as he did under King Henry VIII. I do wonder whether Arthur would have shared his brother Henry's drive to lay claim to and wage war for French lands in the early years of his reign, and if he didn't, then in turn I wonder whether England would have been drawn into the so-called Holy League, because if they weren't, then logically there would have been no invasion of France in 1512, and thus James IV of Scots is, I think, unlikely to have invaded England, and thus he would not have been killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. Instead, he would have survived, continued to rule in Scotland with Arthur's sister Margaret at his side as his queen. What, though, of Arthur's other surviving siblings? Mary, I think, would almost certainly have been married off as part of some diplomatic deal, and perhaps the ageing King Louis XII of France would still have been her groom. However, I do think that it is perhaps more likely that Mary's betrothal to Philip and Juana of Castile's son Charles, who would go on to become the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, would instead have been allowed to stand, that it is him that she would have married, and thus Mary Tudor would have lived out her days as Holy Roman Empress. As for Prince Henry, Duke of York, with his well-known passion for physical pursuits and war games, I think he could have been the ideal fixer, or perhaps that should be hatchet man, in support of his brother's rule. That he would have been first in line to put down any rebellion, willing to bring both the nobility and the commons to heel. If this were the case, I think we can safely assume that a fittingly royal match would have been found for Prince Henry. Likely, I think, a Spanish or even a Portuguese princess. Perhaps, whoever she was, if she were Spanish or Portuguese, she would bring to her marriage a dowry that might include lands in the so-called New World, which had been, for the most part, split between Spain and Portugal. And if this had been the case, then England would have got its first toehold in the Americas around a century before the creation of Jamestown ever happened. I do question, though, what this particular regime and its successors would have made of that toehold in terms of the founding of colonies, and when I think about it, my inclination is probably not that much. There is, however, another possible future for Prince Henry, albeit one that I think would only have been possible if Arthur and Katherine had managed to sufficiently fill a nursery of their own children. And that future would have seen Henry be allowed to pursue his evident interest in ecclesiastical matters professionally. I'm saying that rather than marry, he might have been able to become a churchman. Henry's Defence of the Seven Sacraments, which was published in 1521 as a response to Martin Luther's publication of his 95 Theses, would, I believe, still have earned him the praise of Pope Leo X, to whom this text was dedicated. I think that Henry would have received preferential treatment in both Rome and in England. At some point, he would, I believe, have been made both a papal legate and a cardinal. After William Warham's death in 1532, Henry could well have replaced him as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Might Henry, in his time as a churchman, have managed to position himself in such a way that he could even have been elected Pope in 1534, following the death of Clement VII? Having considered this new timeline and its options, I certainly don't think that the Reformation would have come to England when, how, or why it did. Arthur, like his siblings, was raised in obedience to the Roman Catholic Church, and his Queen Katherine was also known to be utterly devout in her faith too. If anything, with the possibility of there being more Habsburg Tudor marriages being made during Arthur's reign, I think that instead the Inquisition would have held greater presence in England than the Reformation, at least for a while. With that being said, what can't be ignored is that there was a spread of reforming thought in Europe, and we should pay particular attention to the locations where that spread was happening. During the 16th and 17th centuries, England's nearest neighbours would become increasingly Lutheran or Calvinist. It is likely then, I think, that the Reformation would have arrived in England eventually, and that when it did, it would have been more recognisably Lutheran or more possibly Calvinist in form. This would in turn have affected the doctrine, practice and worship style of the church in England. It would have looked more like the churches of its neighbours, rather than the Roman Catholic light version that Henry VIII actually created. Following on from this, if the faith of England had become Lutheran or indeed Calvinist in character, I do wonder whether anyone would have felt the need to board the Mayflower, to set sail for America and the promise of freedom to practice their faith as they saw fit. As Arthur's father and two of his siblings, Margaret and Henry, lived into their 50s, we might suppose that, aside from an accident or illness, Arthur might expect to enjoy the same longevity. If so, this would have seen him surviving into the mid to late 1530s, and if he lived this long, he may in fact have outlived his wife, Katherine of Aragon, who died on the 7th of January 1536. If she had borne Arthur a son, perhaps before this couple's own accession to the throne in 1509, then that boy would have been at least in his mid-20s when it was his time to come to the throne. And this would have given him, if he existed, plenty of time to have married and produced heirs of his own before he ever became king. Maybe then, England's royal family would still be carrying the surname Tudor today. And I did deliberately say England, because if this were the case, then presumably there would have been no union of the crowns under King James VI and first. In fact, there would have been no King James I, and thus no United Kingdom later either. When this lack of a United Kingdom is coupled with the potential of England having a much diminished role in the plantation and colonisation of America, then the place of England as a nation and also the English language would surely be markedly different than it is today. But what do you think of this counterfactual history that I have presented today? Do you agree with me? Or do you have a different interpretation of how things might have played out? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. But I would also love it if you could pop an emoji or social glyph in the comments too. And that is because the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube recognises it as something that's worth sharing. And that in turn helps us to grow this community. In terms of an emoji, I'm happy to do free choice, but maybe you could let me know what you think the family of Arthur and Katherine might have looked like. How many princes and princesses do you think they might have had? Why not put those emojis in the comment section for me? You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all of the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. And if you did, please share it with your friends. In fact, if you like the channel, let your pals know about it. You can let me know that you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel. And if you think you're subscribed, have a little check. Make sure that YouTube has not unsubscribed you against your will. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded and also when I am next planning to go live, which I know you do not want to miss. I hope that you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.